I'm not going to drag this out this waiting bit any longer. Welcome to the session Federating Together eGov and RNE. So we started thinking about, me and Ken, how to sort of spin this panel, and we decided that we were lazy and made it into a panel instead of a series of presentations. So we're going to have three titans of trust up here talking about various aspects of interfederation with a focus on government to RNE collaborations. And the speakers today are Ken Klingenstein from Internet 2 and NSTIC, John Bradley from Ping Identity, and Nils Fjälkegård from the Swedish e-government agency, e-identity agency, I should say. They're going to do a short intro here, and then we're going to be having a panel debate, which means that you get to play. So listen carefully, listen actively, and have those questions prepared for when they run out of steam. So with that, Ken, would you set us on the path?
Is this on? Is it on now? Now it's on. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Leif. Two quick comments as we start. One is Leif and John are wearing Hawaiian print shirts, and that's to acknowledge one of those sweet souls departed. So I wanted to make sure. Secondly, we have I have way too many slides. I wanted to put them in there for inclusiveness, but this will look like full motion JPEG on more than a few times here, and just bear with it. Is this, why don't you?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay. We okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I feel thrilled to be able to use my first title with 2 colons in it. This is a new high in the, in fact, there have been studies done that more papers get accepted if they have a colon in the title than if they don't. So I figured 2 colons, wow.
I'm sorry. It won't bow.
You want to move my ear?
No, this is...
Van Gogh. Okay. We okay? No, not okay. Use this one? Okay. Let me take off the...
Sorry.
John, you've rented me things in the past. Okay. Contents, real quickly, again, this will be a bit of a blur, talking about internet identity today in one slide, RNE federations, what we've done, NSTIC in the identity ecosystem, my particular grant in this process, and then closing with the attribute ecosystem, which is really what we should be talking about versus the identity ecosystem. So social identity, at least in the US, is reaching saturation. Almost everybody has a social ID account. And the access is shifting from grabbing these peoples to using those authentications and third-party stuff, et cetera. John's been heavily at work in that space. Protocol may be evolving from OpenID to OpenID Connect. John may have an opinion about that evolution. OAuth is out there as well. And then we see continued efforts from some of these social identity providers to climb the LOA stack. So if you haven't seen that in your country, well, I think all of us have seen the two-factor stuff that Google's offering. Twitter has moved to two-factor because of some hacks on Newswire accounts, et cetera. But they're really trying to get a business opportunity going around this. And so very interesting things are happening in that space. Federated identity continues to grow, and it tends to still dominate the interorganizational interactions, where social identity is maybe what the consumer or customer will bring to a company. Within a company, we still see a heavy orientation around traditional SAML and federated identity. We see other verticals building multilateral federations now, just as the RNE community has. When this started, the verticals thought that it was going to be bilateral relationships. We've been talking about multilateral since day one. That elevates the importance of metadata in life. And then interfederation is moving forward slowly but steadily, and John will be talking more about that. And then we see interesting hybrids, social to SAML gateways. We'll be deploying several in the US. And then Gakunin in Japan did a SAML to social gateway because the student identities were really valuable to third parties out there who were doing social. And then we do see new hybrids coming, and again, I think John will touch about that. R&E federations have led the way in this space. We created many of the protocols, privacy preserving by design. I think that's what separated us from the very beginning. We rejected PKI not only because it was way too hard, but also because it seemed to be leading with identity, and we knew that we had to lead with something else other than identity and reveal identity if needed. We thought multilateral from the start. We've been involved in managing privacy, hopefully passing that management of privacy from the IDP to the end user, and I'll be talking about that perilous step of moving it into the hands of the end user and what may and may not happen in that process. Now we're starting to talk about the certification of applications in various phrases. Lastly, we're all starting to play with anonymous credentials. Many of you heard the Irma talk yesterday from Roland. We're also playing with that. Other places are as well. We're going to be converging our efforts. This is an important piece that I'll talk about in just a bit. We should mention that government and R&E federations have a history of working together. We were funded as federating technologies in the first place by governments. Our use cases were often to corporate partners at the very beginning, largely content-oriented. We had new use cases with federal agencies. Now we have all of these interesting perimeter problems. Medical hospitals are the slippery slope for us because a research hospital is a member of the university, but it has patients which are parts of the community, and then they reach out to clinics, and suddenly we're in the masses. And then how do we handle that? Within the U.S. government, there's been two efforts historically. There's the orthodox effort, which is called FICAM. It's Classic Identity Services for Government. It includes high assurance cards. It includes some PKI. It now includes federation. But the FICAM effort is production. The NSTIC effort that I'll be talking about is about innovation and coordination going forward. So the distinction is one is operational, one is less operational and more influential, visionary, the NSTIC program. It's next gen. And then there's two different efforts within that, and I'll talk about those in a second. The scope of it may even reach to Maastricht. So NSTIC stands for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Let me handle the scoping issue right off the bat. It is a pure finesse. Theoretically, the U.S. government can only talk about interactions between citizens and government agencies. That's all it's authorized to do. This program is trying to affect a lot more than that. It's trying to affect the marketplace. It's trying to affect how Google interacts with its players and its personnel. Does the U.S. government have a say in that? And secondly, the second finesse is that this is just U.S., except nothing that the U.S. does is just U.S. Certainly the NIST standards leaked out to become normative standards for the rest of the world. And now as NIST goes and changes those standards, you ought to be paying attention to that. But at the meetings of this activity, there were regularly many governments from countries in this room attending those meetings as well, paying attention, not pledging allegiance, paying attention though. There's both the development activities and the governance activities. It faces lots of challenges. I'll get into that shortly. I will say that the model that NSTIC is pursuing works for us as a community. It is very much privacy preserving. That is not an accident. They were influenced by a placemat that some of those sweet souls departed did in 2001 in an Ethiopian restaurant. I wish I would have saved the placemat. It's important. The NSTIC governance is trying to define the rules for electronic identity, and again, the finesse statement. Privacy rules, security rules, robustness rules, usability rules, et cetera. Many of the big players are there. Some of the bigger players are not there at the table. It's had to negotiate all kinds of weird things. By the way, the model for this effort is the smart power grid, which was done in the U.S. by bringing companies and consumers and all kinds of stakeholders together inside the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, for 2 years' worth of brutal process that emerged with the smart power grid. And you can tell me whether you think that's successful or not, based upon your own experiences. I was checking my smart power meter from here today, figuring out exactly what appliances were being turned on in my house back in Colorado, and there was no security on that. You tell me if that is a successful model. I'll leave it to the reader. So NSTIC has funded 5 pilots, and that's a URL to the pilots, very different worldviews. We were one of those 5 pilots. Here's a list of the 5 pilots that were funded. I've put stars next to the 2 that we're most engaged with. I think I've talked yesterday about some of the other stuff. The multi-factor mobile authentication actually is 5-factor authentication, and I was kidding Roland for only being stuck at 2. Have they done anything else in this puzzle space to elevate the identity proofing or other parts of the assurance problem? No, we're after factors. I'll leave it at that. Other kinds of activities as well. Let me talk about this one just briefly because it's such a different worldview than the one that we have. Monetization of attributes. And as with all things in life, John had some early hand in it, smelled how strange this was, and had the good sense to walk away, but we can ask John some questions down the road. This is moving from bulk verification of information to per attribute verification for a fee. So today, if I want to make sure, Roland's filled out a web form and said, ship it to my home address and filled it out, I want to make sure it's Roland's home address. How do I do that? Today, I buy a $10 credit report from Equifax or one of the other verifiers, Experian. I don't care about most of the information. I just want to verify his postal address. This pilot will move to a marketplace for verifying postal addresses. So I filled out my postal address on a form. I click the verification button. The vendor will go, great, I got permission to verify these things. I'm going to go to the marketplace. Oh, the U.S. Post Office charges 75 cents to validate an address. Oh, Google charges $1 to validate an address. Oh, Equifax charges $1.25. Is there a difference in the verification? I can't tell. I see a difference in cost. Is that a difference in quality? That part of the equation has not been defined. It's the U.S. It's just on the cost. So you get, but what's interesting is that we're a partner in this. I didn't sign on, but we're signed on. We're going to be selling studentness. Studentness is a very important attribute to lots of vendors. And the freshness of studentness is very important too. And we have the freshest data. What's interesting about that is it's going to introduce a hybrid economy, because today, if you looked at in common, probably the most common attribute being passed is studentness, and we don't charge per basis, per verification. And now somebody wants to charge. We'll see how it goes. Who gets the money? We'll see how it goes. Interesting experiment. Stay tuned. Our primary grant, however, is scalable privacy. Those are some of the partners. Those are some of the emphases. I'm not going to cover all of them in the interest of time, but I will drill down to 1 or 2. Promotion of 2-factor authentication. I think that's gotten to be pretty much of a bottom line rule going forward for identity management. Citizen-centric attributes, I'll drill down into that in a second. Trusted metadata, I'll get to that. We are working on a next generation privacy manager as well. And for those of you who have seen the fine work that the Swiss did on YouApprove, we're trying to take that to the next level. And that including things like informed consent, which is going to be very hard to do. Anonymous credentials I've alluded to, and then we have a set of pilots in multi-factor. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over these use cases of how they fit together. They're in the deck. And I think actually for the people in this room, you know how those piece parts fit together. So I don't think I need that explanation. We're going to be going deep into MFA. I'm not going to drill down into the particular issues here, other than to say that Federated identity leverages MFA powerfully. I have an old snapshot of somebody from 15 years ago with wearing suspenders filled with second factor devices. And they would log onto this computer and they'd go, oh, which device? And flip up to that, and then flip up to this one. Replacing it with a single second factor that can be used in multiple locations. Real win. Let's stress that part of how federated identity leverages multi-factor authentication and gets rid of the suspenders. Let me skip over all of these things. Outcomes. By the way, in case you're looking for some code enhancements, we are going to be producing a generic SHIB login handler that can handle a variety of second factors. We'll be producing a CAS multi-factor login handler for those of you who are using CAS as your federating and login tool. And then the insert software that we have a open space tomorrow, and I urge you to attend insert. It also is being funded by this work. So we're producing code as well as experience. We have about 1.1 million users available for this multi-factor experiment. That's a pretty good number. We'll see how well it takes up. Different deployment strategies, by the way. At MIT, what they're doing is they're allowing anybody to use a second factor. So you will go to the SHIB IDP, and it will say, would you like to be enabled with second factor? That's very different than most of the other strategies for second factor, which does a risk analysis and says, these are the critical applications, and let's put MFA here. This is going to be seeing how far the community has gone in terms of, oh, it's available to me. Do I want it? Again, moving this. Citizen-centric attribute delivery. We've produced a schema catalog and attribute registry. I'll show you that in 2 seconds. We're using that to annotate use cases with how these citizen-centric attributes could be used in this particular use case. We're developing a cookbook to serve citizens. There's an old Twilight Zone issue. I don't know how much the Twilight Zone made it over here to Europe as a series of things, but to serve mankind. If you know that Twilight Zone issue, we're going to do the same hideous activities that was done. We're doing a GPI proof of conduct, some bindings and refactoring and engagement with the privacy manager. Let me step out right now then and show you some of these things. So this, let's see, I'll begin with this. This is on the Scalable Privacy website, and the URL is available, and I've done something wrong. No? Okay. Okay. This is the listing of all of the attributes we could find in the world that looked citizen-centric from all the schema in the world. Find your favorite schema, find your favorite attributes in here. Yes, we use Shack a lot in this. Victoriano, thank you. There it is. But when you get down to this interesting one, and you are the only attribute class that has defined citizenship, as far as we can tell. And then we get down to something like name. And who doesn't define name? Et cetera, et cetera. What this suggests is that anything that can foster convergence of attributes would be welcome. We're going to try to do that by annotating use cases with suggested attributes. Nobody put us in charge to build the definitive citizen person schema, but we want to try to nurture convergence on this, on this space. Another major focus that we're working on is disabilities. And so if you don't know about GPII.net, please learn about it. It's a multinational effort with significant funding in the EU to raise the accessibility of the public infrastructure. And accessibility is defined very broadly to include not only disabilities like physical disabilities, such as color blindness, I need to have the screen structured a different way, to aging disabilities, my key clicks are not as fast as they used to be, to cognitive disabilities. I've had a traumatic brain injury, I cannot do depth first search, which turns out to be a very common consequence of traumatic brain injury. So I need a linear presentation. What's interesting about that is I can't make that adaptation in the browser. I have to make it back at the content. So it argues for creating a set of preferences per user that can be used to restructure content to fit that user. These people have done an extremely good job at it. So they have already standardized the schema through ISO. It's 9 pages long. It's reasonable. It's got controlled vocabulary, everything you'd want to see in there. And now you go, how can I set preferences for 9 different pages of attributes? They're building tools that will allow medical practitioners to give you a prescription and a schema setting. And you take that schema setting and you stick it in your personal data wallet. You all have personal data wallets, or will soon. And then that will be used to customize content. So these people are doing very much the right job, and I think it's, we will be doing some demonstrations of this work using Umer and SAML both, and Keith Hazelton's working on this, and we should have the demos done within a couple of weeks, and it's cool stuff. 1 minute, I'll go back to the slides. Half a minute. Okay. I will show you all the stuff that you want to look up online. We have use cases, the proofs of concept. The privacy manager, one thing that's particularly interesting in the privacy manager development is the idea of nudging. You've seen nudging in authentication, where a password meter comes up as you're typing your password to give you the strength of your password. Can that concept be applied to privacy management? Because where users are today is not where we want them to be down the road. So can we nudge them along? I think that's a fruitful area of research over the next several years, and we're getting the academic research community involved in that. I won't get into any of this stuff other than to mention that these are the 3 goals for anonymity that the US government has defined as important, and the federated identity that all of us push cannot do the unobservability element. It can do the other 2 things quite well, but it can't do unobservability. These anonymous credentials can provide us with unobservability, so they add a new arrow to our quiver. And it's, as many of us will attest, it's not an easy arrow to master. And when we start to bring other concepts like informed consent into this, it's going to be really hard, but it's really important. I'll skip over these flows, skip over the anonymous credential. Again, all the stuff will be online, deployment models. Boy, I think I need to get to the very end if I've got no time left. Half a minute. 10 seconds. 10 seconds. The bottom line here is we shouldn't be talking about the identity ecosystem. We should be talking about the attribute ecosystem. Get the emphasis onto the right piece of the puzzle. And when you start to do the attribute ecosystem, lots of rich objects. Heather, the slide is in use. And what's really interesting about the attribute ecosystem is that when you look at the flows of attributes, getting there, that's a flow of attributes. That's our standard flow of attributes in federated identity. From the identity provider to the application provider with the user getting involved. When you add metadata, the flows are much more interesting. And the flows of metadata are completely different than the flows of the attributes that the metadata enables. And I think that's the lesson, that the metadata is going to be this place that we'll be working on. When John talks about interfederation, he'll be talking a lot about metadata. Here's how you can stay informed, and more than stay informed, help us do the heavy lifting. We'd welcome it. We want this to work globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So, John, you're up next. So, John Bradley from Ping Identity is going to talk to us about, I don't know what.
Is there a slide advancer thing?
There is a slide advancer thingy. Okay. I don't know which way you point it though, but
At you.
but I won't.
Does it have a laser?
No.
So one observation from Ken's presentation, I think it's identity, ecosystem, and attribute ecosystem. Whenever I talk to the NSTIC people and I call it an ecosystem, they think I'm being snarky and ironic, which I am. It reminds me of a number of meetings I attend. Anyways, I'm going to talk to you about interfederation technologies and Mario. So over the past couple of days, I've had a number of people, i.e. more than one, ask me, what is this Mario thing you're up to? Well, it isn't a video game. Exactly. You thought it was a video game. So, is Mario a quest for the Interfederation Grail? That's, by the way, in case you don't recognize him, that's Ian Young when he was younger, up there with the helmet. Hi, Ian, I know you're listening at home. It's a nice family picture I managed to find on the internet of you. It is kind of a quest for the Interfederation Grail. Is it a secret society? And these slides don't actually come through on the projector very well. You probably don't want to be a member of any group that involves these people. I know I wouldn't. You get a prize at the end if you can identify all of them. So what Mario is about interfederation at scale. So this is kind of beyond the leading edge in some ways, but it is something that we have to grapple with. So a number of us have started thinking about this and scribbling stuff down. We need to establish the Internet of Trust to shorten time to market. That's important from a number of different perspectives, including commercial. Lowering maintenance costs, enabling global discovery. I'm dealing with enterprises that are now looking at something upwards of 40,000 connections. An SP with 40,000 IDPs that they have to configure and maintain. I have a number that I know of well over 10,000 each. And all of those IDPs are connected to multiple SPs. We have millions and millions of connections that are going to be upon us within a very short amount of time. And these are either completely without federation now or perhaps in multiple federations in some cases. So we've come up with some basic concepts which people may or may not agree with. We have the concept of a trust service provider, which connects at least one or more end customers to what in R&E we would think of as a federation. There are cloud services that kind of act as federations in the commercial world. There's something called Ping 1, which Ping operates. There's other sorts of commercial federations which act mostly as hubs at the moment, but are going have to address the full mesh issues because not everyone is going to join every hub. That's completely impractical, though probably a lot of people on the commercial side would think that's good money, but not practical for scaling. So we need these new things which don't really exist at the moment. Trust exchange providers, which are entities that are going to hoover up the metadata from the trust service providers, mix it, filter it based on entity attributes, other things, and provide it back down across the network. So we're talking about trust routing through metadata. So this is a simple diagram. These trust service providers, it could be EduGain, this could be the Open Identity Exchange, or pings, this could be an Open Identity Exchange stuff. We have the customers at the various ends, but we need people who deal, people who deal, where was I? I've lost my, I thought that was back. There, okay. I jumped to the end somehow, okay. But we need people who have the relationships with the customers and can offload their decision processing in a trusted way. And these may be hubs, they may be metadata providers, some mix of those. And we need trusted services because at some point we're going to have so many trust service providers that having a full mesh of them just isn't practical. So we're going to have some trusted organizations who say, yes, you as a trust service provider are capable of having these tags asserted in your metadata as being reliable. Now, the metadata may be SAML metadata about IDPs and SPs. It may be OpenID Connect metadata about Connect and OAuth. It may be attribute metadata about attribute providers and what attributes they can reliably provide. We're seeing more interest from people like Google in metadata, mostly around discovery. So actually, when a user goes to an SP or SaaS provider, allowing them to do SP-initiated login and wind up at the right IDP is an amazingly hard problem. And if you don't have some sort of metadata to do that routing, it generally turns into an impossible problem at even the scales we have now. So that's probably one of the first sort of commercial things that we're going to try and work on, is actually solving some of the discovery problems in conjunction with Account Chooser and some of the other services that are going on. One of the other things that people are looking at for selection of IDPs and SPs is whether or not you can indicate some sort of level of trust in the person's personal account chooser. You're trying to log into a bad site, you might not want to do that, etc. And all of that could be signaled to the user agent out of the metadata if the user agent has a trusted source of metadata. So what we're trying to achieve is a scalable infrastructure, way to leverage third parties to manage the trust, and most importantly, be able to bridge the research and education, commercial and government federations. I know in the UK, OIX is managing a bunch of the government stuff there, and being able to interfederate that with different organizations is something that's on the agenda there. So we have a number of relationships that we're looking at and things that are sort of happening in different places. Looking at InCommon and the other NRENs as trust service providers, which they are, even if they don't necessarily think of themselves as that. Ping Identity is going to be standing up a trust service provider for our customers. Like I said, we kind of already have one, but we don't describe it as that. EduGain is arguably fills very close to a trust exchange provider role now. We have Peer as software for managing the user interface and registration. OIX is looking at becoming a trust exchange provider for a number of governments. We have the Shibboleth metadata aggregator, Leif's Pi. How do you say it? We have, which is great. I recommend it to everyone who needs as software for trust service provider and trust exchange provider. MDX, which Ian is editor of now, and WebFinger, which is just finishing up an IETF for discovery of user identifiers to map them back to identity providers. And of course, you may or may not have seen Ian's writings on metadata exchange. So on my slides, the links are actually clickable, so you can go and dig into some of this information. So what we're trying to do, once we get around to it, because we are kind of busy guys, so help would be appreciated for those of you that are interested, is defining some concepts and framework definitions. Part of our original thinking, and I think we were drinking someplace in Amsterdam when we came up with this, if I recall. It's a bit hazy for me. It was late last year. What we wanted to try and do was concentrate on the federations and the trust service providers and try to get something organized amongst ourselves and do something more practical and tangible and try and come up with some sort of agreement on how operational infrastructure would look for us to actually, if we wanted to exchange metadata, how would we do it? What would the tags look like? What would the protocols be? So less abstract and more, how are we actually going to do this? Because we want to figure it out before somebody says, oh yeah, can you do that next week? Because we already sold it. Yeah. My CIO already promised the other CIOs that this is going to be in place for Global Net Plus in 6 months, so what you gonna do? That was about 2 weeks ago that they made that decision. They just haven't told us yet. But hey, I work for a commercial provider now, so you can't believe anything I say. I'm just a total liar, fibber. So we have a projectmario.org webpage, which is kind of a work in progress. We should probably, we should probably take down the demo site and actually say something. And there's also a Google group for those of you crazy enough to want to join in the conversation. And that's it for my presentation. I can answer questions later on any topic you like. Exotic fibers are one of my favorites. Yes, Heather.
Yeah, we'll take you up on that, John, definitely. Okay, and we'll do, since this is a panel, we'll do question at the end. But for now, we're going to get like a totally different. If that was the crazy ass wacko perspective, from yeah, we'll have the totally, the government, the official government position now, at least.
Boring grey one.
And we can. The theme for this conference is when we're picking a random country, we're picking Sweden. Right? It's just,
I find no country more random than Sweden.
It's a random country, totally.
Is this working? Yeah, you can hear me on this. Yeah, so I'm going to bring out my very orange slides here, hopefully. Yeah, it's a tribute to Holland, just for this session. Yeah, like Leif said, I'm a bit I feel like the odd one out here in the panel, both close-wise and also presentation-wise. I'm a lawyer, so a lot of these things just go through my ears and out on the other side. But I'll be focusing a bit more on the policy side of this and also how we're trying to sort of evolve the Swedish EID system and sort of enabling it for interfederation per se. So I represent a small Swedish government agency responsible for the area electronic identification and electronic signatures. It was formed in 2011, so we're quite new, and it was a result of a government report. Everything in Sweden is a result of a government report. So whatever you do, it takes 5 years to do something new. Now we're actually in a full operation here. It's a very small government agency. We have 4 employees only, so you have 25% of the workforce here today representing. We're organized under the tax authority, so that's a bit of a muscles, at least on our side. And it's governed by a board of influential people from representing public sector and private sector with interest into this field of EID. So 6 directors and 4 employees is usually a recipe for disaster, but it's working somehow for us. So our mission is to coordinate and support electronic identification and signature for public sector, and we're also administrating this infrastructure and this public federation for Swedish EID that I'm going to talk a bit more about. So looking at EID in Sweden today, where we're standing, we usually describe it as a success story. Maybe that's why we're invited as the random country to talk at these events. But it's currently we have more than 4 million people in Sweden in possession of an EID. I think the figure's up to 4.8 million at the moment. I think we have some 5.6, 5.7 unique EIDs issued. At the moment, just as a reference, we have about 9 million inhabitants in Sweden at the moment. We have PKI-based EIDs at the moment, but it's both soft certificates, hard solutions, and also mobile solutions since last year. So it's a wide variety, but they're all PKI-based at the moment. E-identification is used more than 250 million times, so 250 million transactions last year. Most of that is in the internet banks at the moment, so EID is used for access to our internet banking. That has been a key driver, I would say, of the EID usage in Sweden, that it's also possible to use the EID for internet banking. For public sector, the figure is some 65 million transactions for 2012. So the thing that sort of differentiates Sweden from most of the other European countries when it comes to the choice of EID solution is that we have EIDs are issued by private sector. So there's no government issued EID in Sweden at the moment. So the main providers here are banks and one of the large telecommunication providers. So that's where you get your EID. So the government has acted as setting the requirements for the EID, procuring the solutions for public sector, but there's been no issuance of the EID from public sector. So what public sector does is purchasing validation control from these EID providers on a commercial basis, and then within this purchase of validation control, also setting up the requirements for the delivery of the service, which is, for instance, then requirements on identity proofing and the technology chosen and so forth. So that's essentially where we're standing at the moment, and trying to then see what the next steps we should take. How do we evolve this system? We've been working with this since the last millennium, basically. It's I think the first of these solutions were up and running in late 90s. The first framework agreement was procured for validation control for the Swedish sector. So essentially we're trying to see what we can do. We have a lot of history, a lot of luggage, we have a lot of EIDs issued, and what's the logical next step to take. So we try to boil that down into sort of 5 points, which is essentially what we're doing in Sweden right now. And the first of them is that we have established this e-identification board to coordinate and support this area, and that hasn't been done previously in Sweden. I don't really know how we managed, actually. It's been ridiculously cheap for public sector, and somehow we managed to get pretty secure solutions out there. But we've been heavily relying on the fact that we have the banks and telecommunication providers, which are serious actors, and basically we haven't had any major incidents within this field in Sweden. But now we have an agency responsible, and we have the possibility of sort of gradual development of this infrastructure. The second aspect why we're sort of doing something now and not 5 years ago or 5 years ahead in time is that we are now under the European directives for public procurement. I don't know if you heard about those, but they can be a real pain in the ass sometimes. But that essentially means we can't really set up the system the way we've done before. So a framework agreement won't do it for us. Basically, a framework agreement at the moment means you have to when you make a call off from the framework agreement, you need to choose the one supplier which provides the lowest price or the most sort of economically sound offer. And that means that if the Swedish tax authority wants to procure this out of a framework agreement, they can only choose one of our EID providers. And we want to build this on a federated approach where you can choose any of our EID providers, and you can have multiple EID providers, but still be able to, in line with legislation, purchase that validation control or purchase those SAML assertions or whatever it might be. So that's a key issue for us trying to solve that. We found a way to circumvent the procurement directives by introducing a service concession here. So that's essentially what we're setting up, a service concession-based system. We call it a freedom of choice system. Essentially, we're setting the requirements. Any EID issuer that gets above the bar, we allow into this system. And based on my choice of EID, I go to the provider, I choose an EID. If the EID provider is approved and goes over the bar, they're allowed into the system, they can offer the services. And when I use my EID for the tax authority services, for instance, the tax authority pays money to my EID provider. So that's how the whole system is set up. This is one of the, I don't know if it's only us in Sweden that are actually caring about this procurement legislation or not. Sometimes I get the feeling that we are the only ones doing so. But this has been one of the key issues that we've had to solve. And I'd be happy to share some insights about that later as well. The more technical part of what we're doing, and I don't think I have to explain that in detail to you guys here, is that we're moving towards SAML as our way of our interoperability model, let's say. And previously, we've had this more or less pipeline integration of PKI validation control going for each individual issuer of EID. And now we're moving towards the SAML-based infrastructure, mainly to simplify the integration for our e-services. So regardless of the EID, regardless of the provider of the EID, they will always have to rely on the same standard identity assertion, basically. So that's one of the key issues why we're moving towards that direction. As we said before, SAML assertions are very very positive in terms of integrity as well. We can choose not to send all of the information within the ID. We can also add extra attributes within this SAML assertion, such as there's a pilot going on now, for instance, covering the right to sign for a company. So our national company registration is now setting up a pilot trying to deliver that information in form of an attribute as well. So hopefully we can solve some of our issues connected to e-services for companies based on that as well. And one of the final points, we're moving towards a more technology neutral sort of infrastructure here on the EID side, let's say. So we don't really care in our trust framework and the requirements we set up what type of technology is used for the actual EID. We're setting up a trust framework. If you fulfill the requirements in the trust framework, you can provide basically any type of solution as long as you provide us with the SAML assertion at the end. So that's essentially what we're doing on the technology side here. And as a consequence of that, we also have to solve the sort of electronic signature part of this. Because if we're not requesting our citizens to have a PKI-based EID, we can't really depend on them coming with the ability to sign documents themselves. So basically, we have to put on a PKI layer on top of our SAML infrastructure. And that's one of our let's say, a bit interesting sort of technological solutions that we've come up with. You can ask Leif more about that at the end as well. I think he'll be happy to share some thoughts on how that is set up more.
I thought I'd ask you that.
Okay, yeah, you can do that as well. But that's certainly an interesting aspect as well that you might want to look into. And the last part, of course, we're setting up a federated infrastructure here. So while we're using metadata, we are acting as a federation operator, the identification board, and basically hooking up our e-services with our TSPs or our identity providers. And this also, of course, enables our hopefully interfederation at some point where we are opening up for proxy IDs and proxy IDPs and so forth to be able to jack into European infrastructure, to US infrastructure, Canadian, whatever it might be. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the trust framework as well, how we're setting up our levels of assurance and how we could map that as well. So like I said, I'm a lawyer, so it's more of a legal architecture I'm trying to sketch up for you here. But basically, we are responsible for setting up this public federation. And we're doing that, of course, we have our providers of e-services, our relying parties at the right end here. We're doing this for public service, for public sector, as I said. We have our suppliers of EID service here. That's essentially our IDPs and the Swedish EID board in the middle. And we're setting up a legal framework for this identity federation. We're setting up an assurance framework covering all these aspects of identity proofing and authentication and so forth. And we're setting up a technical framework then relying on SAML to make this interoperable. So that's essentially what we're providing. Now we're acting as a federation operator for public sector, but this whole legal framework, assurance framework, the whole setup can be cloned and applied to a private federation as well. So basically, if you want to use this for private sector, you can more or less take it as a package and apply it to a private sector federation. But we don't have the mandate to act as a federation operator for private sector services here. So that's what we're doing for the federation, but we're also providing what we call a base infrastructure. So basically that's sort of an accreditation scheme that we are doing both for public and private sectors. So we're putting a quality stamp on our issuers of Swedish EID. So Swedish EID will be our concept. We're putting a quality stamp on all of those issuers of EID, fulfilling the requirements in the assurance framework for that relevant level of assurance. So basically what we're doing, we're introducing the assurance framework concept for Sweden. We haven't had that before. We are introducing different levels of assurance for Sweden as well. We haven't had that before. I don't think we see a lot of EID systems on a government basis at the moment who have different levels of assurance. So that's certainly something I think we're first up with. We're having some problems how we actually communicate these different levels of assurance to the public. That's going to be interesting as well. Can they actually understand that there's a difference in assurance on different types of EIDs? But that's what we're doing, putting the quality stamp on the Swedish EID, and hopefully that will also be able to make it possible for these issuers of Swedish EID to take their EID outside of the Swedish context and also show that we have a level of assurance 3, a level of assurance 4 Swedish EID that can be used in other contexts as well. We're building our assurance framework on as many international standards or de facto standards as we can find. We've been using the NIST 863, of course, which has been the basis for a lot of these frameworks. We are also looking into the Kantara framework and also the coming ISO 29115 standard. I think you can hope a bit more for that standard, but we're sort of taking all of these assurance frameworks in. We're trying to set up a Swedish hybrid that is conformant with all of them, basically. Or as conformant as we can be today, because this whole policy area is, of course, very, very, very difficult to navigate in at the moment, and we don't have any clear sort of ways in which we should go. There's a lot of things going on at the moment in the EU. You surely heard of the new regulation being negotiated at the moment on EID and trusted services, and we don't really know which way the EU policy will take at this moment. So we have to be open and flexible, I think, in our trust assurance framework in which way we set this up to match also with the EU legislation. So my time is running up here. This is very short insight into what we're doing. Some time frames here. We're actually getting this law on service concession in place 1st of July this year. So we're moving into a very sharp production here. We're going to review and have a session of parties here of our trust service providers and our relying parties from somewhere third quarter of 2013. So coming September, October sometime, we will start letting the parties into this federation. And we aim to have the full new system up and running by the first quarter next year. So basically our federation will be set up and running live sometime first quarter next year. The legal framework will be published in a 1.0 version within a month, so that you can also access via our website. And we'll have a sort of parallel provision of these EID services going from 2013 to 2016. And that depends on the fact that we have this old sort of provision of EIDs on old contracts so some of our e-services for public sector will be relying on contracts from this old solution, this old PKI-based solution. And we're going to have a period of time where we need to migrate our existing e-services over to this new federated approach. And that's going to create some difficulties for us as well, but the last point in which all of our e-services will be over to this new solution, the new federated approach, will be 2016. So that's essentially what I was trying to just give you a picture of what's going on in Sweden at the moment and how hopefully we will enable interfederation at some point at least in the future. And yeah, some contact details and some websites where you can find some more information. It's mainly in Swedish, unfortunately, but yeah, Google Translate or or contact us. Thank you.
Yeah, how's that for a setup? I made notes during the presentations on my phone. I have to scroll several pages here for all the questions I have. The one I want to start with, though, is sort of off the left field a little bit. I had an email conversation with an EU parliamentarian the last few months, many long threads with somebody who's representing the Pirate Party in the EU Parliament. And she basically began this thread saying, I've heard what you guys are doing, and I'm gonna propose legislation to make SAML illegal. Good luck, bastards. Well, she wasn't saying that, but she was basically being really upset about sort of this thing that we were building and using that was leaking information in identity providers, in log records mainly, about what users are doing online, right? You're logging into a relying party, and that IDP knows that you've logged into that relying party. So, is this the death of SAML? Is it the death of federated identity? And do you all expect to go to jail? That's my question. Anyone can just say, but when you start speaking, press the little button on the microphone. Feel free to keep it sort of live, and then you can all. There is a button on the console there. That you press that, the microphone lights up, and you can speak.
So I think the structure that is being alluded to is the unobservability, and the fact that it's known which IDP you came from, and maybe from that we can get the logs, etc. There are certainly government efforts, Canada being most notable, that are trying to do some kind of double blind there to conceal that information. A question I had for Niels when he said that they're going to be paying per they're going to be paying the identity providers. don't you have to know then who the identity provider is? And so, in fact, won't the pirate party be really upset about the fact that you're actually paying people to keep logs of stuff that is revealing personal information?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. No, I've had some discussions with this parliamentarian as well, and it's since she's Swedish. I think that there's a saying from the Swedish foreign ministry. He usually says that don't make the best the possible the enemy of the possible, basically. And I think Samuel gets a lot of sort of. Let's say bad will from integrity from an integrity perspective, but looking at what we have in Sweden at the moment, it's by no means better, and that is not criticized at all, basically. So I would say that moving from this PKI based infrastructure where we have validation control and purchase of validation control, you get even more information about the actual identifications on a personal level connected to the individual e-service. So that's sort of, even though we're not moving towards the best solution, I think we're certainly moving towards something better with SAML, because it enables at least us to not give away all the attributes all the time, but we can actually choose a bit more which attributes we are actually sending towards the e-service. But I think that integrity is really a key issue here, and I think that even though we're trying to build a system where we are moving towards a SAML-based infrastructure, but we're also open for development. So essentially, we're certainly interested in what's happening within the ABC for Trust and how you can use the SAML standard to sort of increase the integrity-wise and make sure that these identity providers don't actually misuse the information aggregated within these services. What we're doing from a regulatory perspective is that we are by means of contracts making sure that they can't use that information aggregated to anything that is sort of outside the scope of the purpose of what we're doing. But in that sense, we are heavily relying on the data protection laws and so forth being in place and working, and I think that's essentially what we can do at the moment while looking into different options for solving this in the future.
Before I ask John to follow up with his explaining of how OpenID Connect will solve all these issues, but I have a question from the floor.
I was going to ask it anyway, but it seemed a very good follow-on actually to both Leif's question and Nils's answer. Ken said that he's looking to move consent to the user or move privacy control to the user. I think that's the wrong place for it to be. I think the user should be helped by a framework that says there is some privacy control, some privacy things that should never happen, which I think is what Nils was saying. There are some privacy things that should happen by default, because the benefit to society is far greater than any slight threat to the individual. Individuals can opt out if they wish. And then there's a bit in the middle where the user is actually able to exercise a privacy choice rather than giving the user the entire scope of deeply harmful to completely harmless to try and get some cognitive understanding of which you say yes and which you say no. I'd be interested if there's been any looking at the things that might actually be, you've mentioned the top end.
Right. Ken, are you in fact assuming more knowledge on the part of the user, more understanding than they're capable of receiving, or capable of doing, Ken? Is that it? That was for you, Ken.
That's for me.
Yeah.
Well, if I had...
Are you assuming the user is more clueful than they are, I think is the...
I'm assuming Swedish users, yes.
Well, then, yeah. Forget it.
They're all blonde.
Yeah.
Andrew raises a very interesting point, and there probably is a continuum here that we have yet to investigate, and some things should be out of the hands of the user. But right now, all of the controls we have are in the hands of the IDP, and that's certainly what we've seen, interestingly, is that the IDP is probably far more protective of the user's privacy than the user will be. And part of that is because IDPs that we deal with are university IDPs, and they have this in loco parentis sets of issues, et cetera. And I think it's going to be a very difficult transformation to move from control at the IDP to control by the user. We're going to have to work that well. We're going to have to educate the user. How much of that will migrate from the IDP to the user? Stay tuned.
I can also add to that point. I mean, we're also. I mean, the system as we're setting it up in Sweden, as it is now, it doesn't sort of hinder IDPs that are self-declared sort of integrity-proof. So basically, we are. There's a possibility for a user-driven development of IDP solutions or identity providers, which are also taking that extra steps of guaranteeing the personal integrity. At the moment, as I said, the EID issuers in Sweden are the banks and one of the telecommunication providers, and usually there's a lot of trust into these parties. But as we're opening up the system, of course, we're going to see IDPs which are also not banks and not trusted telecommunication providers. So I think there's certainly. So we have to see where the development sort of is going here, but I think the key point from a Swedish perspective is that we are handling this from a regulatory perspective at the moment, and we're trying to be open for whatever comes our way basically in the future. But I think still you might get the impression when talking about SAML in this context that it's actually taking a step to the worst. But basically, from a Swedish perspective, it's not. It's taking a step in the right direction, but maybe not going all the way. And well, that has to do with a lot of different reasons.
So there's always the question of whether or not you should go all the way. There's a bunch of competing interests, and to some extent, there's social dynamics to this. In Europe, people tend to trust the government more than they do enterprise. In the US, people tend to trust enterprise more than they do the government. And it's ironic that the government in the US keeps trying to protect people from the enterprise, and the people want the enterprises to protect them from the government. So it's an odd situation. I agree that, we have, Microsoft invented click fatigue with Vista around their security management policy. Replicating that same problem with consent isn't necessarily the right way to go. But we also have our friends in the Pirate Party who also who are concerned about the IDP getting knowledge of what the user is doing. Well, the IDP has, in many cases, a fiduciary responsibility to not let the user log into the Russian phishing site or release certain attributes to people that aren't qualified to get them. If you blind the IDP to all of the information that it could use to actually help the user, when we do have an ecosystem of user-driven, co-op identity providers, that would be a really nice thing to happen. Maybe Sweden or Norway or some one of the Scandinavian countries will bring us co-op identity providers. But if we put into legislation protections against an imaginary identity provider misuse of information about where people are going, we also cut ourselves off from a bunch of things that we could do to help users. So we need to be careful about that. One of the things that is valuable, I think, undeniably, is giving users the ability to consent to the release of attributes. And that's something that we haven't traditionally done in SAML or traditionally done in RNE because people are kind of captive of the institution. The institution makes the decision for you traditionally, and in enterprise and those sorts of scenarios. So the idea of individual consent of release of attributes has really been a social web sort of thing to some extent with OpenID. We did a lot of work with that in information cards, which was a horrible failure for other reasons. But the notion that individuals would consent to the release of particular attributes, which has this bind in that it overloads the user so that they don't know whether they either consent to everything or consent to nothing. So there has to be some balance and perhaps some degree of help to get the user to agree to appropriate things or not be bothered asking for things that are completely obvious.
And one of the pieces of research suggests that a blend of consent and notification where I give consent and then I set a notification trigger to be, so that I don't have to give repeated consent for X time or X types of relying parties. Some blend like that might give us the kinds of solutions we need.
So I can't help but observe the irony of the pirate party shilling for Microsoft's proprietary technology, but getting, as the information cards taught us, getting even the might of Microsoft, getting user agent stuff into a browser to do identity selection, Microsoft couldn't do, even though they controlled all of the platform. Well, except in Europe where you had to have a choice, but essentially they had a big hammer and they couldn't do it. So getting, especially now that we have mobile devices and we don't have a single platform anymore, getting user agents into all of the devices is really a hard thing. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying it's a good thing, but it's probably harder than most people actually anticipate, having failed at that miserably in my past. So we have people like Microsoft and others saying, yeah, we can't do it. We can't do ABC for privacy in the native with a native agent in the users under the user's control. So we'll just host it in the cloud. Well, okay. So the cloud hoster now gets to see both ends of the transactions. So you can push around who gets to see everything. Yes, Canada is bidirectionally blinded, except for SecureKey, which is a private company which runs the proxy, which can see both directions. So yes, it's perfectly privacy preserving, except that you wind up creating honeypots with really good information that if I were a bad person, and I'm not saying I'm not, I would go after to get that information.
Notice none of us chimed in when you said that.
Nobody is opposing your that. I'm waiting for somebody to jump off in your defense, but so what is interfederation a technical issue, or is it a policy issue, or is it both? I mean, what are the big blockers in your views?
It's both. It's also an economic issue. At some point, the pain becomes so unbearable of the maintenance. So even without the bells and whistles of tagging and all of the fancy things that we like to think about, when you have thousands or tens of thousands of connections, just dealing with certificate rollover and automating that is a real big financial bonus. So in the end, it's probably the fact that in order to interoperate and be successful as a business, you have to participate in some sort of interfederation. Otherwise, your costs just won't allow you to be efficient.
Ken, your views?
Yeah, I think John raised an excellent point, which is we haven't reached the economic pain point that's going to encourage interfederation.
Some people are starting to get there.
So Niels, I mean, do you see interfederation use? I mean, I know that you're sort of not. That's not your first priority when you're standing up a federation. But are you looking ahead to in an e-government setting and thinking, well, this might actually be an interfederation use case?
I mean, certainly, and it's I think it's one of the key things that we have to keep in mind when setting up the policy for our federation, and also in the choice of technology, I would say, which is one of the reasons why we chose SAML 2.0 as well as our standard for interoperability. But I would say that, coming from a legal perspective, I would say the policy issues are certainly the larger part of what's troubling us when trying to set up interfederation and trying to find even European common grounds for federating identity. And I think the negotiations right now going on the EU regulation shows that it's not a simple question trying to solve this issue of how we're supposed to interfederate European identities.
Basically. I think it's time for our stork moment. I think it's... Go ahead.
No, but I mean, I'm not going to sit here and...
We're going to have a stork moment in every presentation. I mean, it's just to get it over with.
As I'm representing government, I'm not going to say anything bad about stork, but I can just say that we have some challenges with stork, and I think it just goes to show. I mean, how many stork PEPs nodes do we have up and running at the moment? I mean, it's a handful, maybe, or at least 2 hands. You can count them on. How many actual transactions do we have running at the moment? I mean, it's not a lot. And I mean, looking at Sweden, I think we have one e-service integrated into the stork historic infrastructure, and that's address change, international address change. And I think it's sort of, and we have, I think, maybe 100 or so transactions of that. And I think it goes to show this sort of economical, financial incentives are not really there yet in order for us to sort of look at this in a large scale perspective. So I think that's one of the key things that's sort of setting us back from a European policy perspective, is that the use cases from an e-government perspective are still sort of slightly limited, and we're not seeing these mass transactions or mass demand of being able to utilize EID over borders for cross-border e-government services. So that's one of the key policies issues, I would say. But the other part of that is from an e-service perspective. We're going to have some issues trying to sort of redefine our Swedish e-services in order to be able to interpret something else than a Swedish personal identifier, basically. So I mean, all of our Swedish e-services are set up to interpret the Swedish identifier, and certainly we have to decide on something else from a European or international perspective. That's going to be sort of infer a lot of costs for our Swedish e-service to try to build something, a new backbone system relying on something else than that Swedish identifier. So I think that's sort of one of the key things here as well, finding that European common grounds in terms of these identifiers, these attributes. How do we define the right to sign for a company, basically, on a European basis? That's going to be a real pain in the ass trying to solve that, I would say.
I mean, one of the just before I let Ken, I see you're sort of chomping out a bit there. One of the use cases that I've heard for in global, sort of, well, not global, but at least inter-federation between governments is border crossings. You know, there are certain borders on the planet that are sort of more heavily sort of regulated than others, right? And that also have a lot of streams of people. I mean, we have Norway to Sweden. I mean, that used to be a border where we actually checked passports, right? And there was a lot of process around that. Now we decided to. Yeah, we stopped doing that a long time ago, but there are many other places on the planet where people actually do a lot of procedure on border crossing, right? And in some places these have been more or less automated, right? Is that a place where we could do interfederation between governments?
That was actually the subject of one of my NSTIC pilots, which got shot down.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So there's a huge amount of money to be saved by governments, especially if you look at the bureaucracy that the American government has around issuing visas to people from my country. It's a huge amount of money that's spent on having staff in remote countries to be able to manually process visa applications. So we were I was working with the State Department to figure out how we could use EID systems in other countries. So if Sweden, assuming that, you know, once the visa regulations go back for Sweden for you to enter the U.S.
Or Norway,
especially Norway.
Yeah.
But imagine if we had an EID system in Chile where your identity was vetted, you had a proper electronic credential, records could be correlated against that. You could do an online application for a visa rather than turning up with a stack of paper in an embassy and trying to negotiate that for 6 months to get your visa. So there's both a pain reduction in people trying to get paperwork dealing with governments for crossing the border and an actual cost savings for people, for the governments, for those that still require visas for entry.
Right. I mean, I don't know if David is in the room. David, I mean, what's your experience buying a house, right? And you're a Danish citizen. You bought a house in Sweden, right? Yeah. Did you have to? But you could never use any of your Danish identity in those processes, right?
No, I had to have a Swedish social security number, and as I didn't, they had to type in my Danish one, and that apparently worked because they both have 10 digits. So I now also have a Swedish bank account.
Oh, that's not going to cause a namespace collision at some point. I wonder who owns your house. What were you thinking?
I think we have a use case there.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. I mean, and I was sort of wondering whether there are other regions that are that don't respect national borders, that carry a lot of, typically regions that would carry a lot of economic activity, where you would find plenty of use cases for international interfederation. But I don't know.
I think there are certainly use cases, and I'm not going against that as well. But I think maybe we're trying to bite off a bit too big part of the cake at one moment, especially from a EU policy perspective, where I think we're maybe going a bit too far in our ambitions in trying to say that all e-services should be able to accept all EIDs. And when looking at, for instance, we have some e-services for booking parking spaces in our local communes or municipalities. And I mean, why do we need to accept the Spanish EID there? Is that really cost efficient? That's sort of those types of questions I think need to be brought into that discussion as well. But I think you sort of get I sometimes get the feeling that from an EU policy perspective, this is a technology question. It sort of the whole interoperability aspect of EIDs is a technology question. It's not a policy question, and that sort of disturbs me a bit, as I see a lot of challenges in trying to get this to work.
Just to go back to your earlier question of is interfederation, are the barriers more technical or policy? I agree strongly with Niels that I think the barriers are going to be more policy than technology, and the technical people in this room who feel insulted that we're not the highest barrier are actively diverging our metadata approaches and other kinds of things so that the technology fusion at the end will be as hard as the policy stuff. So we don't want to be the second hardest problem. We want to be the hardest problem. And I applaud all of you for going off in different directions as we are to make it hard.
Right. So, I mean, if we're talking about legal, then what should we be keeping an eye on, right, for the future? You mentioned we know, for instance, there is new legislation being drafted for personal protection in the EU. Is any of the stuff that's going on at the EU level going to hurt us, or is it going to sort of make no difference, or is it stuff we have to keep an eye on?
I think certainly from an interoperability perspective and from a policy perspective, looking at interoperability, I think what we are doing now in sort of isolated islands is setting up our own different assurance frameworks and our own different sort of trust frameworks for building our levels of assurance. Now, if we're lucky, we're building that on basically the same 4 levels of assurance, but who knows? So what will come out of the EU regulation, for instance, will that be compatible with those 4 levels of assurance and so forth? So I think one of the key things that I would applaud is all of us moving in the same direction when it comes to defining our levels of assurance and trying to find common grounds. And I think the ISO standard, or the ambitions with the ISO standard, was sort of going in the right direction there. But maybe we need some more work on that and able to be fully rely on that when building our own national assurance frameworks or our own sort of federation assurance frameworks.
Yeah,
So that's
29115 does not contain all the answers. It
no,
needs to
that
be profiled.
unfortunately, yeah, it's
Well, fortunately, depends on your perspective.
yeah.
But are we having
They
the
could have had
conversation
the
in
wrong answers.
I mean, are we having the conversations in the right places? There are very few regulators who visit these workshops, right?
Yeah.
Where should we be having these discussions? How do we make sure that we're not sort of somehow in some corner of the legislative sort of jungle out there and not screwing ourselves up?
So I was deeply depressed by Robin's presentation this morning, as he intended, especially on the cookie legislation. So I would ask, Robin, what went south in the cookie legislation? How could we, as technocrats who understand this, shaped a better answer than what emerged?
Nothing like being put on the spot, is there? Okay, so what went wrong with the cookie legislation primarily was that, having started with the best of intentions, in other words, that users were being tracked more than they were aware of by things that were being put on their machine, and that we ought to do something about that. So that's a pretty laudable aim. They then focused specifically on the mechanism of cookies and said, this is the thing that is wrong, this is the thing that needs to be managed. And then they dived off down the road of so-called consent. And anyone who's experienced that legislation in action by going to a site in the EU that says something about cookies will have seen how unsatisfactory the consent dialogue is. Because it basically says, we set cookies, you click on this to agree to everything in our privacy policy, or get lost. So, for a start, they botched the idea of consent completely. They didn't put anything in the legislation that said, this is what we mean by meaningful, informed, explicit consent. And it's amazing how in subsequent regulatory guidelines like the OECD and the Council of Europe, the word consent is now preceded by an ever-growing list of qualifiers. And that list gets longer and longer. Explicit, what did I say? So meaningful, informed, explicit, and unambiguous has now been added as well. So it's like authentication factors. If you haven't qualified the word consent with at least 4, you don't know what you're talking about. So that's one thing. They botched the issue of consent. But their focus on cookies as the mechanism rather than the problem of tracking without consent, it itself created problems.
No, it created opportunities for those people that came up with alternative ways other than cookies to do exactly the same tracking, in some cases much more effectively.
Exactly, and so we have to be really careful when we're pushing for legislation in these areas, because we might get what we wished for. And actually, if you imagine website operators being properly forbidden to use cookies from tomorrow, what mechanisms would they use, given that their desire to track you has not gone away? Would they start using things over which you have no possibility of control or even awareness? At least cookies you can delete, but what would they use other than that? And you've seen persistent cookies come out and things stored elsewhere. So that's a couple of things that have gone wrong. Yeah.
Oh, wait for the microphone.
A SAML persistent ID would do very nicely as a tracking thing.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not going to get into the IDP as a panoptical discussion, because that's been around since I first heard that objection in about 2002, 2003. And thanks to the wonder of wireless and the internet, I checked up the MEP's age at that time. She was only 14 when that argument was first raised. So I'm going to give her some leeway on that one.
Right. So I was looking at my notes, and one of the things that I sort of thought about when you were mentioning your ideas, Niels, of co-op IDPs, or whoever mentioned that. So is that where the privacy troll would keep their ID? I mean, how do we satisfy the requirements of of the 1% who really, really care about how their identity is being processed? And or do we just tell them that, sorry, this is not for you? What do we do?
Well, some sort of co-op or allowing people to run their own identity providers. We actually have when I did OpenID Connect, we have a self-issued identity provider which adheres to the same protocol, but you can run your own identity provider on your own device, on your smartphone or whatever if you want to. There's like 12 nerds who will actually do it, but as long as the relying party gets the appropriate assurances, sure, providing it's a choice in identity providers, including being able to run your own. Most people are going to be lazy and go with some trusted brand who they trust to actually give them help about attribute release, etc. If you decide you're a privacy troll and go off on your own, then you have to make all of your own privacy decisions, which is probably what you want to do in the first place.
So is that technology dependent? I mean, you mentioned OpenID Connect here, and one of the things that I got out of Neil's description of how do you actually set one of these up, of national federation, you have to go through all of these, there are procurements. In his case, he even had to rewrite part of Swedish national legislation. And at that point, you've sort of given up it's really difficult to be agile, right? I mean, the week after, we deploy SAML in Sweden, somebody comes up with, SAML 4 or 3.5, right? And then we have to swing to that. How do you stay agile in a government, e-government federation?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I've seen lots of attempts that have failed. But the best people are managing to do is like Sweden, the UK has a fairly similar program. the trust framework provider process, which I helped develop in the U.S. For the U.S. federal government, in principle, allows for a wide selection of identity providers. It's just that the economic model doesn't really exist there, so it's kind of been languishing. But you have to somehow have a standardized pricing infrastructure so you need a standard for identity providers to adhere to so that people can go to those identity providers, and you need those identity providers to agree to some sort of pricing regime so that the purchasers of the identity can actually know what it is they're going to be paying, and don't have people, you could have an identity provider set up that charged $1 million per credential, and all of you and all your friends go there and repeatedly log into the government service. I know you've thought about that, haven't you? Yeah. So you have to be careful that the system doesn't get gamed, but
so Ken, I mean, we're talking about economic models, and you mentioned NSTIC. Does NSTIC have a view of an economic model? How is identity going to be pushed out, from Jeremy's office to Google or Amazon and whatnot?
It's ironic that you ask if an activity has an economic model that burned through 3 years of funding in a year and a half. The
lawyers had the economic model.
So the answer is I don't think so at this point. I'm curious about in the economic model in Sweden of paying the identity providers, is that going to be a per transaction or a subscription fee? I think that's one of the places where life gets very interesting. And then back to this this ultimate privacy and the pirate party, I do think mixing anonymous credentials and federated identity of either flavor, SAML or OpenID Connect, probably gives us the right ingredients. It's going to be how do we stitch them together, especially when we have an ever-growing list of adjectives in front of the word consent. And I know that ABC for Trust, when developed, had no notion of consent being informed, let alone unambiguous, let alone being, I forget the other two adjectives that are used, and there'll probably be 3 or 4 more ones out there.
I think Google is adding 2 more, and one is ubiquitous, and the other is implicit, right? And if you look at, I invite everybody to Google for Google's 5-year plan of identity, right? And you will read their view on logout and their view of, especially how when you buy a phone, you get a so-called God token on the phone when you buy it, right? And that decision to purchase an Android phone counts as implicit consent for the duration of your owning that phone, and you will be logged into all Google-enabled sites from browsers on that phone, right?
Well, you have the option of turning the phone off. But yeah, other than that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the model our vendors are envisioning, right?
But that's the way Android works now.
Right.
So.
Are we even in the game, or are we just sitting here inventing stories for ourselves?
I think that's certainly one of the very interesting aspects here. We're trying to or at least a lot of our sort of European EID solutions are sort of pushed from the top, coming from the government. So we're saying use this, and we have the other side of this, which being the things that the users actually have, the Google accounts, the Facebook accounts, and so forth. And I think one interesting aspect of building this open Swedish infrastructure for EID suppliers is that sooner or later we're going to get that application from someone saying, well, we want to be an issuer of Swedish EID on level 1 or level 2 or whatever it might be. But we're going to see somewhere in the middle, we're going to have a meeting of those two. And from an e-government perspective, I think that's really interesting to see what will we allow, what will be our sort of, what will be the tax authority reaction to Google coming and providing the EID for our taxpayers. I mean, that's going to be a very interesting factor. I think when it comes to this agile part of it, I think it's difficult for governments to be agile. We'll never be fully agile, but I think there are certainly things you can do to be more agile. And I think this approach that we are moving towards now, where we're not actually ourselves defining the technology, at least not on the EID part. We're allowing for competition, and hopefully competition drives innovation, and saying that, well, you can use whatever you want. But of course, we have to point to certain technology to solve the interoperability question, and that's going to be SAML for now. But I think having an open mind and a possibility to change our requirements and to change that infrastructure is really what we have, the only thing we can do in these terms. I think I just want to connect to this unambiguous as well. We're seeing it now also coming into the EU regulation. I don't know if you read it, but we have there the unambiguous attribution of personal identification data, and I think there's a new level of assurance for you. I don't know what that is. I've never heard of unambiguity when it comes to attributing personal identification data. That's new for me.
So our privacy manager work is being done by the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon University. And we now have a report up on the Scalable Privacy website that they did that shows that over 90% of the users of Google, Yahoo, and Facebook do not know what information is being released to providers or how to change what's being released to providers, over 90%. So I spoke to the Carnegie Mellon people recently. I needed an expert for an NSTIC meeting in San Jose, and I said, where are the best usability people in San Jose? Are they at Stanford? And the answer was, no, they're at Google. So how can Google employ the best usability people in the world, and yet 90% of the people who are using Google don't know what information is being released? What's broken here is...
It's not broken. It's not broken. Google is employing them. It's usable for Google. You just don't understand the relationship. Means, yeah. Yes, it's usable so that people perform the activities to enrich Google. I mean, you know, the usability people at Google are not working in someone's abstract best interest. I mean,
they're just very good at what they do.
Yeah, they get free lunch every day.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to ask you to do your final 15-second rant on any topic in this space. What do you want to leave the audience with? John, you first.
There are so many things that interfederation is an inevitability. Otherwise, we're going to hit the identity barrier of the internet. You know, we've largely solved the lower level problems. In most cases, that bandwidth is not the limiting factor anymore. It's really being able to scale identity so that you can actually get the appropriate security and services. I know, it was over 10 years ago when I started my first identity provider, and my plan was to essentially give away free bandwidth and sell value-added services. So I wired up buildings with 100 megabit Ethernet and such. So, you know, I was probably 10 or 15 years ahead of my time, but I still think that people will be purchasing services on the internet, and the perimeter for those services will be identity. That people like Google don't see you buying. You know, when you buy an Android device, you're not buying a phone. What you're doing is you're subscribing to a cloud service and having an identifier attached to that. And the phone is merely an interface into that cloud service. That as I talk to their development teams for Chrome, the browser, Chrome OS, etc., those are all interfaces into a single cloud service that they see you as managing. So they have a very different perspective on what happens when you purchase an Android device. Of course, you're logged into Google all the time. That's what you bought it for.
Niels, final thoughts?
I guess coming from the legal perspective, it has to be sort of a policy point, and I think just judging by the experiences that we've seen from setting up the Swedish Federation is that it's a bit of a jungle out there trying to build this policy and trying to come up with an idea what's the right policy to set to be future-proof, basically, and to be able to enable interfederation and make sure that we're not building these isolated islands that will never be able to connect in the future. So I think that's sort of one of my key issues here is trying to find ways of cooperating cross-border and trying to jointly define these common grounds somehow before it's too late, before we have too many initiatives going on into different directions. And certainly one of my key concerns right right now is making sure that the coming EU regulation is going to be enabling interfederation, not only in a European context, but also in the sort of international context, which we'll see undoubtedly in a very short time.
Ken?
So after 14 years of working on what I thought was going to be a 3 to 5 year problem, my guess is that we're less than halfway down this path. I think our pain is that we're on the radar. I was doing TCP/IP in the late 80s, and I was thrilled that there was that ISO information superhighway to come because it was distracting everybody and allowed us to get a whole lot of work done without attention. I think one of the worst things that's happened to us is now we're on the radar.
With that, thank you all for coming. I remind you that if this spurred any ideas, go stick a note on the open space session. This may actually get resolved tomorrow afternoon. We could all come up with we could all settle all of this tomorrow afternoon at any of the open space sessions. So don't miss that opportunity. Don't forget to send in your evaluation forms when you get them linked to you, and don't forget the gala dinner tonight.